everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Research Data and Indigenous Ways of Knowing. My name is Ramona Chibegu, and I am an assistant professor at JSGS and a certified health information management professional. I am pleased to moderate today's event. Thank you for joining us. Today's lecture is organized by the Johnson Shyama Graduate School of Public Policy. JSGS is a national hub for advanced study and research in public policy administration. We are a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan that was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Since our inception in 2007, we have swiftly become one of Canada's leading public schools for educating graduate students and public servants interested in and devoted to advancing public value. At this time, I would like to acknowledge that while today's event is taking place online, JSGS's physical homes are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territories, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Sudaru, Dakota, Lakota, and the Nakota, and the traditional homelands of the Métis. In addition to recognizing these territories, I would like to recognize that I am joining today from the traditional territory of the Adirondron, the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee, and the Lenape, peoples who have long-standing relationships to the land, water, and region of southwestern Ontario. Indeed, I am from southwestern Ontario, and I'm proud of the communities that we have here, as Chad knows. The local First Nation communities of this area include the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, the Oneida Nation of the Thames, and the Munsee Delaware Nation. Today's presenter, Chad Cowie, is joining us from the traditional territory of the Ganegaina, a member of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We are glad to welcome those of you joining us today from across Turtle Island and make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territories we reside on or we are visiting, as in my case. Today, we're talking about research, we're talking about data, and we're talking about Indigenous ways of understanding that data. As I mentioned earlier, my background is in health informatics. And so in a lot of my courses, we talk about Indigenous data sovereignty and a lot of the models that we have been able to advance within Canada. So I'm really excited to hear from Chad about a lot of these really critical conceptualizations and theories that originate from the peoples and different Indigenous communities across Canada. To help our event run smoothly, we ask that all attendees stay muted, turn off your video during the presentation portion of our event, and feel free to turn your videos back on for the Q&A. The format for today's event is as follows. Today's speaker, Chadwick Cowie, will present for approximately 40 minutes. Following this, we'll open up to the audience for Q&A for the remaining time. If you would like to ask a question, please use Zoom's chat function to send your question to myself, Ramona Chibegu, and I will read out your question. Feel free to submit questions at any time during today's event. So if something sort of piques your interest, you can feel free to put that in the chat, and I'll keep note of that. If you have any logistical questions during today's event, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen via Zoom's chat or email her at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. You will be able to find Karen's contact information in the chat. Please note that, as with all of our public lectures, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for viewing on JSGS's website at a later date. So now that the logistics are out of the way, I am pleased to introduce you to today's speaker, Chadwick Cowie. Chadwick Cowie is from the Mishik-Sagwig Nanishabeg community of the Pametakodeyung, as also known as the Kiowa First Nation. He is part of the Atik Caribou Dodum. Chad is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta, where his research focuses on whether or not Indigenous peoples participating in Canada's federal electoral process can bring forth change, decolonization, and reconciliation. Alongside Chad's research, he is currently assisting the 6 Mishik-Anishinaabe communities with research regarding the historical and contemporary existence, not only as individual communities, but also as the Mishik Anishinaabeg, a nation as a whole. In addition to research in this nation and Indigenous electoral participation, Chad also enjoys research in federalism, Indigenous governance, settler Indigenous relations, as well as settler provincial Indigenous relations. So thank you, Chad, for sharing, for joining us today, and I will pass over to you if you'd like to share your slides.
Sounds good, Miigwech. Everyone can see that? Okay. So I'm just going to get started here. So again, Miigwech, for having me. I'm happy to be here to talk with you over Zoom. As mentioned, I'm going to be looking and discussing with you research data and Indigenous ways of knowing. As was highlighted already, I am joining you from territory that the Ganeyaga are the traditional stewards of. This is referring to the Mohawk, who are a member nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And I know that many of you are attending from various treaty areas, but I know in regards to JSGS, they're located on Treaty 4 territory. So I know a few of you are joining from that territory as well. For how this discussion is going to go, here's how I'm going to break it down. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on who I am, because it's really important for this when we talk about Indigenous ways of knowing and research methodologies. Part 1, we'll discuss Indigenous peoples and the Western lens of information research. Part 2, we'll discuss settler colonialism and data. And then we will look at including Indigenous methodologies before we conclude. So who am I? As highlighted by Ramona, I am a member of the Mississauga-Anishinaabe Nation. This is a member nation of the Anishinaabe or the Ojibwe, or which also includes the Chippewa, it includes the Odawa, it includes Potawatomi, as well as the Algonquin. I am from the community of Hamadashquodayang, which by Canadian standards, by Indian standards, is also referred to as Hiawatha First Nation. It is located near the city of Peterborough, Ontario, also known as Nogojawanong in Mississauga-Anishinaabe, which means where the rapids meet. I am a part of the Otikdodam, which is mentioned by Ramona, is the Caribou clan. I come from territory that is covered by many different treaties, going from the Niagara, the Peace of Niagara, obviously the Royal Proclamation, when we talk about the Gunshot Treaty, the Williams Treaties, the Rice Lake Purchases, Crawford Purchases, as well as the Dish with the Spoon Treaty, which is a long-standing treaty that we have had with other nations that bordered us. For the purpose of this research and for the purpose of this presentation, it's also important to note that according to Canadian law and the Indian Act, specifically Section 27 of the Indian Act, I am a ward of the state and I have a permanent record. The reason why I highlight that is because we need to have that, and it needs to be situated for when we start looking at Indigenous peoples and Western lens of information research. Because when we talk and how we look at Indigenous peoples, how it's looked at in research, how it's looked in healthcare, education, in other areas of focus where many people work, there is a lot of inherent bias that comes with that because of how it has been made to look, and including that idea of not being able to look after oneself, needing to be dictated to. And the Indian Act still does that in regards to status First Nations people. Again, Section 27 under Canadian law, unilateral Canadian law, identifies me as being a status Indian, but that also therefore under Canadian law and the Indian Act makes me a ward of the state. So for part 1, I want to go over in regards to headlines, titles, and depictions that we see in news or how things are talked about. And then I want to go into Western science and methodology. And then I want to have a discussion in regards to or discuss with you assumptions of inferiority and stereotyping. These are very important for how we go about looking at how Indigenous people also are brought up and assessed, talked about, written about in regards to research. And when we get ready to do this, this is as you can see, there's a picture on the side here from the Global Mail article. This is from January of 2018. It is related to Tina Fontaine. For many of you who may not remember, Tina Fontaine was a 14-year-old young Indigenous girl who was found, her body was found in the Red River. And the way she was talked about in that, there's a lot of hinting towards alcohol and drug abuse. And as you can see from this Global Mail article, the first thing that's highlighted is that Tina Fontaine had drugs, alcohol in the system when she was killed, according to the toxicologist. Not mentioning that she was 14-year-old, not mentioning that she was murdered. More specifically, just that, again, this is highlighted for specifically drugs and alcohol, which tends to be something that happens, or it tends to be a regular occurrence when Indigenous people are talked about, especially Indigenous women who have gone missing or or we find out that they had been murdered, or that we find their body. It's not just in that case. So we can look at a couple other ones. So during COVID, we saw that Indigenous services announced they were bringing more money in to help with Indigenous communities, especially as we saw increases in case counts in communities. So this is a CTV news article where they say another $650 million in COVID-19 aid bound for Indigenous communities. The way that it's discussed is highlighting, it's another amount without fully discussing that. It's that bite to try to get people into it. But again, when we talk about funding in regards to Indigenous communities, First Nation, Indian, Métis, this is how it is promoted, or this is how it is discussed. It's talked about as like roll the eyes, another amount. Another example, this is my community. This example, this is the chief, the Gima for my community, Lori Carr. Peterborough First Nations want government to provide clean drinking water. The way that's talked about is if we just expect it's done for us, or that they just expect it done. There's more to it than that. For instance, over the last 25 years, the floodplain, the water tables have constantly been contaminated by E. coli and by runoff from different farms, or been impacted by flooding in the area. For example, a flash flood in 2004 happened, where the downtown area of Peter was completely flooded. And in order to protect their sewage system, they released sewage into the water, which then went downriver, went into the lake that my community is on. My community relies on well water. Many people weren't able to drink the water. In some cases, like my mother, she had to buy her own water for 8 years. This is a community in what we typically refer to as southern parts of Canada. We are 45, 50 minutes away from Toronto. But this is the case. But again, it's talking about as if we just expect it. Meanwhile, there is things that have to be done. There's agreements that have to be done with the federal government, and approval usually has to come from the federal government for such projects like this. So it's not so much about wanting to do it, but that it needs to be done, and that there's usually agreements, especially with funding agreements, that are supposed to allow it to happen. Further than that, we look at other titles. So for instance, mining companies and First Nations clashing over Ring of Fire. When we look at that, we forget to look at the fact that we're talking about treated areas. There's contentious issues over hunting grounds, spiritual sites, as well as burial areas that belong to these First Nations who are in those areas. It's talking about clash over it. Meanwhile, there's also a need to remember about whether or not Indigenous peoples should be included in that. The discussion actually needs to have them at the table. The other one that we look at is when we talk in stats and we talk about numbers, majority of Indigenous peoples living off reserve. This gets thrown around a lot. Same with the majority of Aboriginals, if we go back and forth between those two terms. The issue with that is, of course, majority of Indigenous peoples do not live on reserve, because Métis and Inuit, who are also considered Indigenous or Aboriginal, do not live on reserves. First Nations people, or the status Indian according to the Indian Act, live on reserves. So we need to be careful with things like that, because it's very misleading. When we talk about majority of Indigenous peoples, because it includes those three, yes, of course, majority don't live on reserve. But when we're talking about First Nations, it will depend on the community. And there's reasons why in some communities, a majority don't live in those communities. And it's not usually been, over history, it was not usually necessarily just a personal choice to move off. There's reasons, there's other factors that go into it. How we talk about historical events, such as we talk about the Red River Rebellion or the Northwest Rebellion. Well, let's put it into a spin from a Métis perspective, the Northwest Resistance. We need to remember that for these territories such as Saskatchewan in 1885, it was not a province yet. There's still some parts of it that were not fully treated yet. And there's questions that we have to rely on that. Is this actually a rebellion when we're talking about territory that was simply handed over through when the Hudson Bay Company handed it over to the federal government? When we're talking about areas that were not fully treated, we're talking about Indigenous nations, we're talking about Métis people who were there long before Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta comes into existence. And another one that we need to remember as well when we're talking about this, when we're writing about it, Canada's Aboriginals, Canada's Indigenous peoples, Canada's Natives, that it gives a sense of ownership. Same with when we talk about Saskatchewan's First Nations. There's a sense that those entities, such as Canada, or when we say First Nations Saskatchewan, that it came before those Indigenous nations who were there. And that's usually not the case. We need to remember that. And especially when we talk about Canada's Aboriginals, that gives a sense of ownership. It denotes ownership. I do not belong to Canada. I know I'm a ward of the state according to Canadian law, but that is unilateral law. That is not my choice. I do not agree to it, nor do my ancestors agree to it. And it's something that we need to remember when doing that, because we don't always talk like that about other groups of people who are Canadians or who live within what we would call the Canadian state. It's not just in how titles or headlines are highlighted, but also depictions. We can see from these two pictures here. Pictures like this tend to give a note or give a denote of the idea that, Indigenous peoples are simply only addicts, they're homeless, they choose to live in poverty, they don't care about the property. These tend to be how it's looked at. There's more to it than just that, obviously. For instance, the picture here on the side, these two people are simply waiting at a bus line for, I believe, at the old Winnipeg Greyhound station. And in the case for a lot of First Nation communities, when it comes to housing and all that, there's a lot of control that goes on to it and a lot of other things that have to go through. So for instance, in my community, if you want to make renovations, if you want to build a house, you have to go through our chief and council, you have to go through the system, which also has to get approval from Indigenous services. So there's a lot more to it than that. But again, it promotes and gives us those examples of those stereotypes that have come into long existing over time. When we look at Western science and research and methodology, we need to remember how those things that I've just discussed, how those come about. And this is a 400, 500-year process that comes into these mindsets. They are still very prevalent. And it starts because of, well, we can talk about how in 1492, we know Christopher Columbus came. He ventured over here in his ship. He came across and realized that there was another continent here. Indigenous people have always been here. So it's not that it was found, it's not new, it had always existed. It's just both worlds had not actually been in contact before that we know of. The extent that it fully did in 1492, we know the Vikings had came. There is theories about other connections that, for instance, Spanish and Portuguese did know that there was coastline across the Atlantic Ocean, but Christopher Columbus is mainly the first one that really brings us to light, especially for Europe. But following his arrival here and his coming to the Americas, a long-standing discussion starts to occur, especially when we talk about the ability to conquest, the right to colonize, the right to control and conquer, Spanish and Portuguese having the rights to do that, especially in South America. But there's a whole discussion about whether or not Indigenous peoples are actually human. This comes about because at the time the Bible did not talk about this land. It did not talk about Indigenous peoples. So there is a long-standing debate that happens within the church about whether or not Indigenous peoples are human. Comes to the conclusion that yes, they are human, but they are not civilized. And therefore, there's a right to colonize and control them. If they Christianize and they renounce their ways, then they can become civilized in that route. As we move on, we see that with the Enlightenment period, there is a whole other approach that comes to this. The Enlightenment period is this idea of free from bias research, the idea of starting to use the scientific method and humans being human. But we need to remember that this Enlightenment period, what brings about this way of research, it is still bias. It is based in European bias. It is Eurocentric, as we see from some of the ways that some of those key philosophers and thinkers put forth what they were talking about. And it reflected European notions of existence. These notions lead to this idea, again, of Indigenous peoples being uncivilized. They are not at the right standard because there is a whole context of how we come to decide what is considered civilized and what is not, what it means to be a nation or to be a civilized group of people or a society. On top of this, you start to see, again, the fact that there's different views of ways of living by Indigenous peoples compared to Europeans, but also different views on gender and what that actually means from Indigenous perspectives versus what it was in Europe. As time goes on, we start to see, again, this idea of natural selection, survival of the fittest. We see Darwinian theory becomes a big, important part by the 1800s. We also start to see this idea that First Nations, because they're uncivilized and because they're simply going to die off, as it was a common way of looking at it in the 1800s, Indigenous people weren't going to survive to the next century. They weren't going to survive progress. So therefore, they were in the way of progress. They just needed to be put aside until they were no longer existing because they weren't going to be able to survive it. This eventually turns into more views and specific views of specific outlooks of them having substance abuse, specifically with alcohol and then eventually drugs, with the fact of how alcohol is introduced. But again, this idea that because in a civilized world, you're able to till fields, you have a specific way of adding to society. Indigenous people did things differently according to the way it was looked at. We know that many Indigenous nations did do farming. but still looked at as lazy and just expecting handouts, when we need to remember that those handouts are actually related to gifts and in regards to the agreements that actually came into play between the British Crown or the French Crown and those nations who they have contact with. But we can see that, especially by the late 1800s, the early 1900s, that the mindset for how Indigenous people are looked at is really becoming one of being inferior, one that needs to be controlled. They're in the way of progress. And you see this from Duncan Campbell Scott's comment, where he says it is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness by habituating so closely in their residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their village. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of the department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. So again, Duncan Campbell Scott highlighting these ideas of being inferior, that they're going to die at higher levels no matter what, because we need to civilize them and get them into being either able to adjust to progress or simply acknowledging that they're going to they're going to die away. Much of this mentality and the way that this is approached comes in and gets involved with settler colonialism. And this is a very important thing for when we're talking about how Canada approaches Indigenous people, how Canada does research, how the United States, how Australia, New Zealand, these countries where they are what we would call settler colonial states, and how they go about doing research. For this part, I'm going to do a little discussion. I'm going to highlight what settler colonialism is, why it's important that we understand this. And then I'm going to talk about, especially from 1960 on, because we see from 1960 on a change from this idea of being inferior, not going to survive, to this idea that socioeconomic issues are what is the plight for Indigenous peoples, and that's what needs to be fixed, while ignoring the entire history of colonization that had gone on up to that point, and that still goes on to this date. We need to remember Canada is still a settler colonial state. Indigenous nations, peoples are still colonized. Again, remember, Section 27 of the Indian Act, I'm awarded a state. Following that, we'll talk about research in Canada and Indigenous people. So looking at some of the stats that have came up in regards to this. So what is settler colonialism? So I've only put 3 of the points up here, but there are 4, so I'm going to mention those quickly. We need to remember that settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism. The functions through the replacement of Indigenous peoples with settler societies that over time develops a distinctive identity and concept of their sovereignty. Settler colonialism can be distinguished from other forms of colonialism in the following ways. Settler colonizers come to stay. Settler colonial invasion is a structure, not an event. Settler colonialism seeks its own end, unlike other types of colonialism, in which the goal is to maintain colonial structures and imbalances of power between the colonizer and colonized. And settler colonization trends toward the ending of colonial difference in the form of a supreme and unchallenged settler state and people. Why is settler colonialism important when we're looking at research in places like Canada? Well, for what I just highlighted, we need to remember that this is how Indigenous people have been approached. They have been separated. And then the dominant way of thinking, the dominant way of systems being put in place, Canadian structures formulated out of the British structure, are put in place and forced onto these people, ways of government, ways of family, or the idea of how and what they're supposed to do in order to be able to be part of productive parts of society. And then this idea of citizenship, Canadian citizenship, remember, absorbing. But again, it's not acknowledging that history of colonization, which causes even more problems with that. So again, as I said, post-1960, you see this transition from this idea of being inferior, not being able to, they're not going to survive, because by 1960, obviously Indigenous peoples, First Nations especially, had not disappeared. Métis people hadn't disappeared, although they're not recognized still at this time. Inuit people had not gone away. So there's a movement from this idea that they're obviously going to simply die off and disappear to, well, how do we assimilate? How do we integrate them? And that the way, what causes the difference and what's causing the issues for Indigenous peoples is socioeconomic issues. But that's not what reports after inquiry have said. There has been many things that have been said, and we see that especially from the Hoffman report. And before, there's been many things that have talked about the issues facing Indigenous peoples, some to do with how the structure in place, the control. But again, after the 60s, there's still this focus on socioeconomic woes, which is what the Hoffman report did. And this idea of recognizing Indigenous peoples as citizens plus was something that was put forth as a suggestion from it. But again, socioeconomic woes as the root cause of Indigenous disparity rather than inferiority and Darwinian theory, rather than actually taking into consideration colonial legacy. Who is doing this research and how's it being approached? Because at this time, obviously, it's not Indigenous people who are doing this research. And the fact that when we're talking about this, there is still there's a pan-Indigenous process that gets put forth when we're talking about this. And we see that pan-Indigenous approach still very much rampant today. We also need to remember that, again, citizenship, by giving citizenship to Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, it will open economic opportunities for Indigenous peoples. For the Métis, they got the rights to become citizens in 1870. This wasn't to simply grant them as being equal citizens. It was utilized as a way of opening the West to more settlement from those who are of good English background, good English Protestant background, as well as opening it up to be allowing for other people who could come in and be utilized to be able to help with farming, to be able to give to those the main areas such as Ontario and the English elite in Quebec, as well as in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick after Confederation. But again, it wasn't to bring them in as citizens, and we saw that with how Métis rights were chipped away after that. Inuit are granted the right as citizens to be citizens in 1951. Not again to actually treat them as equal citizens. They're treated like human flagpoles. They are utilized in the Cold War as a way of being able to claim sovereignty in the North in regards to what was going on. For many of them, although they're granted the right to citizenship, most of them don't get to vote until the late 1970s because ballot boxes and ballots are prevented from actually being given to them because there is an assumption that it would be too costly to give them or to bring them up there. Status First Nations or status Indians are granted the right to be Canadian in 1960 without losing their identity. But again, what conversation happened with those people in regards to whether or not this was wanted, and how does it go about doing when it's not recognizing their own membership, their own citizenship to their own nations, and those citizenship that those nations had always had. So again, something that we need to take into consideration. We're talking about colonial legacy because this is a big impact on this. Who is doing this research? Because when we see this is not coming up. We don't see a lot of this stuff start to come up until we see more Indigenous people start to climb the academic ladder, the Western academic ladder, the Canadian academic ladder, or into Canadian bureaucracy and other private sectors. This has an impact as well on stats with how they're approached, because who again is doing the research? So we see stats like that First Nation youth have a 5 to 6 times higher suicide rate, while Inuit have 11 times higher. The average life expectancy for Indigenous people is 15 years shorter. I take that to heart because I'm also left-handed, and left-handed people tend to be 7 years, have a 7 years shorter life expectancy than right-handed people. So, that adding that up, that's 22 years for me right there. Higher adult obesity rates, First Nations, and Inuit at 26%, Métis at 22%, compared to the non-Indigenous population of 16%. But the stats don't tell the full story. Why are those suicide rates where they are? How can you go about doing that? Well, there are Indigenous people who have the conversations, communities are having these discussions, tribal councils are having this discussion, grassroots organizations are having these discussions as how to be able to reflect this. But who is actually listening to that? And are people who are actually in places of power listening to them? And again, who is doing that research? This is an example here. So as this has gone on, and especially as we see from the Royal, when the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is put forth and comes forth with their findings in 1996, there is a flurry of things that are written after that, condemning what is said by the Royal Commission. Because the Royal Commission actually talks about needing to recognize those Indigenous peoples, those people from their separate nations, and recognizing that they're not just public interest groups, or they're not just social interest groups, they're not just interest groups within the Canadian state, but they are actually also reflecting the nations and the communities that come from the treaty areas they come from as being a distinct entity on their own originally. We need to remember for many, Canada is forced upon them. There's not agreement. Indigenous nations have not been at the table, especially First Nations and Inuit, up until recently for Inuit, were not at the table in agreeing to Canada's federation. They were not in agreement with having the Indian Act imposed and having things made restricting their rights that they had prior, or that they're restricting their nationhoods as well, let alone their citizenship, their justice, and so on. We have Tom Flanagan, who comes out with the book First Nations Second Thoughts. This is a response to the Royal Proclamation, simply saying that Indigenous peoples need to just simply realize that they're Canadian citizens and that they've been conquered and to get over it, that there's no reason to recognize it. For anyone who has read that book, there's a lot of issues with how he writes about it because he relies on Western theorists, he relies on Western philosophers for how he decides what is civilized, what is not, what's a nation, what is not. We also have books like Francis Whittison's and Albert Howard's Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, as if it's, just something that is done and, people are making money off this. There's more to it than obviously that. There are many people who are fighting for rebuilding, as highlighted by Ramona in my introduction. I am helping to repiece together the history and the contemporary existence of my own nation and the 6 communities or the 6 bands that we've been divided into by the Canadian state. I'm doing that to make sure that my future children have the ability to learn and know who they are, unlike what I had growing up. And we also have a book like Alan Cairns' Citizens Plus, which is very much like Tom Flanagan's book, but he does it in a very flowery way. You have to read very carefully in between the lines to realize he's very much saying the same thing as Tom Flanagan. Although he does acknowledge that First Nations people should have, certain plus rights because, they had certain agreements and they were here first, but they need to be acknowledged only as Canadian citizens, because by not acknowledging them as the Canadian citizens, that it delegitimizes the Canadian state and, it could unhinge the entire state that exists. We need to actually have a discussion about that because, again, Indigenous people were not at the table. And this research and this way of approaching it affects many areas. I'm going to talk about healthcare specifically here. This idea of being inferior or the stereotypes that came out of this. So Brian Sinclair is the first example. I'll use Brian Sinclair for some of you who may not know. He died in an emergency waiting room in Winnipeg. It was assumed that he was drunk and he had passed out, but that was not the case. Michelle Lebrec is an Oneida woman who a couple of times had gone to emerge or gone to the hospital in London, Ontario. The first time she went in, when she went in 2008, she had gone in because she had a fractured pelvis. It took her 3 trips to the hospital for it to actually be diagnosed as having a fractured pelvis. But in 2008, she'd gone in another time and was complaining about stomach issues and stomach pain. And the emergency doctor who was working with her, simply on his prescription pad, drew a picture of a beer bottle and then put a circle around it and put a line through it. That was his medicine to her, rather than actually dealing with it. This is the type of stuff that comes up. There's assumptions, again, like I've said already about that obviously did not help her. It turned out there was something far more wrong, and she ended up getting the help that she needed for that. But again, her second experience shows that this is not, it's not uncommon. And as someone who's lived in London, Ontario, it's a common thing that happens. They're not just in the healthcare system, but outside of that. And then obviously, as we know, in June of 2020, Joyce Etchepon, who is a Tikimik, she died in a hospital near Quebec City. She was strapped into the bed. She live tweeted it. She recorded it. And you could hear some of the nurses making disparaging comments to her. She had gone in because of pain. There's a medication that they were putting her on. She was concerned about that medication because of stuff to do with her heart. She was trying to get them to understand that. They were telling her to shut up. One nurse obviously made a comment about what would your children think of you? And another one pretty much referred to her as only being good enough to be screwed. And she died. Not too long after this, you see comments from people like Doug Ford, as well as Francois Legault, the premier for Quebec, as well as the former premier for Manitoba, Brian Pallister, saying that their provinces in Canada has no issue of institutional and structural racism. But again, it's very hard to deny when you see the video of Brian Sinclair on the floor in this hospital. It's very hard to deny this when you see the video and you hear those nurses saying what they said to Joyce Etchepon. This is not an isolated experience. They're just 3 examples. They're 3 people who had things that have happened to them. 2 of them who lost their life because of how they were treated based on who they were. We know that this recently happened in Alberta as well during COVID, where someone had gone to the hospital. She was ignored. She ended up passing away as well. This has gone on well before that. In the 1980s, there was a woman, an Indigenous woman, who got hit by a car in Gatineau, and instead of taking her to the hospital, police took her to. They put her up on the side of the road, assuming she was just drunk. She had a concussion. She died. And also in this example, this is a picture from my wedding in November 2017. This is my partner, Dan, and on his side is his mother. His mother was diagnosed with cancer in the summer of 2016. It turned out to be stage 4, so it was not curable. We had 3 years with her. Fortunately, we were lucky enough to have 3 years with her. On my side, in green, is my mother. My mom is from my community. Her Anishinaabe name is Red Thunderbird Woman. She was a veteran. She served in Canada's armed forces from 1975 to 1992. She went on to eventually go back to school, got her degree, her Native Studies degree, and then her teaching degree, and then continued to give back to the community. In February of 2018, she had gone in for a full physical and was told everything was okay. By April, she had developed a cough that would not go away. It was assumed, and she was told she had pneumonia, so she was given penicillin or what is given for pneumonia. May, it got worse. June, she spent 4 days in the hospital. Nothing was looked into. She was released. July 11th, she went into the hospital. She went into the merge again because of this cough and because it wasn't getting better, and she was starting to have issues with breathing. The doctor in the merge finally ordered for scans, and she was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. A couple days later, we had to take her into the hospital because she was having problems breathing. The emerge doctor that we dealt with asked her multiple times about alcohol and drugs, would belittle her when she brought up the fact that when he was trying to make her walk around so that they could get oxygen tests, would not listen to her, that she could not walk around properly, was very rude with her. Again, like I said, kept bringing up alcohol. My mom died 11 days after she was diagnosed. She did not even get a chance to go and talk with the experts for, the process for chemo and what was to go on. She died 11 days after her full diagnosis. It was a shock for us, but this is not an isolated, my mom is not an isolated case, even in my community or the Peterborough Regional Health Area in Ontario. My grandmother was misdiagnosed for a year as well. Assumptions were made about her wanting pills in 2000 when she finally got diagnosed with her cancer and died 3 months later. And just recently, there is someone from my community who, again, keeps being questioned about alcohol and drugs, and they have not been able to figure out what is going on with them. It's been progressively worse, but again, not listening to them. And this has gone over periods of months and times as these people have gone in and approached people in healthcare, trying to get the assistance and trying to do that. But again, assumptions of simple, well, how much alcohol do you drink a day? Are you drinking? Do you drink? What drugs do you take? Are you sure you're not taking drugs? Are you here for pills? Like literally asking, are you here for pills? Assumptions like that, rather than actually taking care of what's going on. Had my mother been able to be properly diagnosed, had things been considered? I don't know. I just know that, and again, comparing the 2 women in this picture, we had 3 years with my mother-in-law. We had 11 days with my mom. There's only one difference between the 2 of them. This mentality utilized is not just in healthcare, though. You need to remember that there's been situations where this has gone on in education. There had been a situation at one school where one of the assignments for students was to talk about the positive impacts of residential schools. This goes alongside Senator Lynn Bayek talking about how we need to talk about the positive things that have happened at residential schools, despite the fact that we know many bad things have happened there. Doesn't matter if there's been some positive things. We need to acknowledge that what these schools did to many people and what that after effect has had on generations after and over the years. Pierre Poilievre in 2008, we know, if for anyone who doesn't know, he's the lead contender for the Conservative leadership right now. In 2008, after the official apology to residential school survivors, was asked about how he felt about this, and his response was he'd feel sorry for Native people when they all got jobs. Lucien Bouchard, after the 1995 referendum, highlighted and telling Jean Chrétien, you mind your Indians, we'll mind ours. Because by this time, the federal Liberal government had started to talk with the Cree and the Inuit up north and trying to convince them to get out and vote on the referendum. They ended up doing it, had huge impacts. There was If it hadn't been for the Korean Inuit coming out in the high numbers that they did to vote, Quebec may have already separated by now. But again, not just this. During Idle No More, taking part in Peterborough, we had school buses with kids, 12-year-olds and 11-year-olds driving by telling us to go get jobs. Where did they learn that from? I used to be involved with the federal Liberal Party of Canada as well. I used to be part of their Indigenous wing of the party. We would get messages such as telling us to go and commit suicide. We would be told, the women in the women who sat on the executive, being told similar things or having written to them what was said to Joyce Echaquan. And nothing really being done from within the party structure, not knowing necessarily what to do, but why it wasn't fully done with it. People on my executive that I was a part of had to take leave of absences because of the mental trauma, the mental and emotional trauma that would kick in for this. And again, this exists in other places. Young Indigenous people being told in the school system, they're not smart enough to do what they want to do. I was told that. My nephew was told that. I worked in recruitment for Concordia University between 2015 to the end of 2018. I heard students being told that when I go to their schools, talking about wanting to go into, looking at going into engineering or wanting to go into nursing or go into psychology. 11, 12-year-olds who were told they wouldn't be able to do it because they were told they weren't smart enough. This was in, again, 2018. To the point of where it's assumed that I just simply took a spot up. Many people, such as myself, who've gone on professionally, who've gone up further up the academic ladder, being told that we're simply taking spaces away from actual people who deserved it. How do we begin rectifying these issues and these biases? We need to understand that inclusion of Indigenous understandings is very important for doing this. Inclusion of Indigenous knowledges and methodologies will be very key for doing this. And it must be understood that settler colonialism is a major contributor when looking at Canadian Indigenous, even Australian Indigenous, Maori New Zealand, and Indigenous American relations. And how to move forward, that needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be understood as being a key factor. And there is ways that we can start doing that now. We have people, we have Indigenous scholars who are adding into this. We have, again, Indigenous people working in very important sectors and very important positions who are contributing to having us be able to move forward on this. This is an example of 3 books. And I'm going to talk about some of what's written in these 3 books for part 3. You have Indigenous statistics. I never in my wildest dreams would have thought that a quantitative research methodology could be looked at through an Indigenous lens. Chris Anderson and Maggie Walter totally showed me I was wrong. Indigenous pathways into social research. The one chapter in here that I'm going to talk about is Louis Okalik's chapter because she is Inuit. She's Inuk, and she talks about how it can be brought together. And it's very important for doing that because we need to remember, again, when we say Indigenous, we're talking Métis, Inuit, and First Nations. They're not all the same, and they will approach things differently. In regards to the Indigenous statistics, Chris Anderson is Métis, Louis Okalik, like I said, is Inuit, and then Margaret Kovac has a Cree background, and she discusses Indigenous methodologies and looks at this idea of the qualitative method process. So I want you to be able to discuss those with you guys. I will give a little bit more detail on the statistics part because there's some explaining that needs to go behind with what's said by them, and it's very interesting. I found it very interesting. For those of you also, again, if someone had talked to me about 8 years ago that I would be talking about methodologies, Indigenous methodologies, or any forms of methodologies, I would have laughed at them. So I again, I'm very thankful to be here talking about this with you, but never thought I would be doing something like this. But these type of literature, this type of literature that now exists, gives me hope for being able to not only, obviously, have these conversations with you today, but that there will be future generations who will be able to do that, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. So to start off, I want to just highlight this quote from Margaret Kovac. Indigenous methodologies flow from tribal knowledge, and while they are allied with seven Western qualitative approaches, there are key distinctions. This is important to remember. There are things that mimic and that can be very much overlapped with the way Western research is done, but there are key things that are also very different, that are very important to approach when you're doing the Indigenous, when you're doing Indigenous research, but also how Indigenous people who are doing that research have to approach it. there is responsibility we have to where we come from. So specifically in regards to Chris Anderson, Maggie Walters, they use Canada as a case study, but also Australia. Maggie Walters specifically focused on Australia. They look at quantitative Indigenous research methodology, and Chris Anderson really focuses on Canada as the case that he focuses on. In chapter 5 specifically, there's details about quantitative Indigenous research methodology wedded to theory of Indigenous density that becomes the focus because of immediacy, to explain how dominant quantitative methodologies can be, and explores the Canadian census inability to enumerate Aboriginal sociality in 3 contexts: a tribal specific context, an urban context, and a Métis national context. Those are the 3 areas that they focus on. It's very important for focus on it because we talk about tribal affiliation, this idea of how they're defined. Well, not necessarily, it's gotten better since they've written this book, where how you're defined usually still came from the government of Canada, has still been very much focused down. It doesn't take into consideration our words for ourselves. You would usually have to find the word that is done in English or that has been written by, or that has been documented by the Canadian state. There is issues with trying to understand urban Indigenous communities because they get left out in this, because you can't properly follow the stats for that. Some cities have worked on this, such as Edmonton, to be able to actually look further into this. And we know certain cities have a high Indigenous population where they might live. But again, the way that it's approached in statistics does not necessarily show what that could actually help with and what services might need to be done and how to approach things in those areas, such as the center of Winnipeg, the north part of Winnipeg, the northeast part of Edmonton, Vancouver North, as well as obviously parts of Regina, Saskatoon, Calgary, even Toronto. They conclude that such narrow focus is somewhat mitigated by Statistics Canada's creation and use of the Aboriginal People Survey, but nonetheless, the categories of identity to which the various indicators of socio-demographic status are cross-tabulated constrict or limit our statistical imagination in ways unhelpful for thinking more broadly about our sociality. So this is kind of important. This is important to acknowledge and highlight as well, because it doesn't allow for bringing in Indigenous ways of thinking. But on top of this, when we're talking about stats, do those Indigenous communities even interact with Stats Canada? Many don't, and that's because of how stats have been used to be able to make decisions in regards to them without actually including them on it. So for instance, Six Nations, the biggest reserve in Canada, the biggest First Nation community in Canada, over 30,000 people, it's listed as 0 on Stats Canada of how many people live there. My community talks about how no one in my community has anything past an undergrad degree. Well, I do, and there's a couple of us in my community who do. We just don't happen to live there. So again, the communities will talk about and the nations will talk about all their members, no matter where they live, while Canada will focus on if they're actually in the geographical area of what is the borders of those communities, which causes problems because, again, it looks like Hiawatha First Nation, my community, there's things that it's not recognized for having when they actually do have. And there's similarities to that for many other places and many other communities. So what they also highlight is that thus, in a very real way, current dominant trends in Aboriginal statistics are writing out alternative and in many cases more positive stories about Aboriginality that potentially sit in stark contrast to the stories told using official data. Again, the lack of level of people who are in graduate school, lack of them who are actually have graduate degrees. Well, of course, many of those people who have graduate degrees might not live in their communities because of where they actually have to be for the jobs that they have worked towards. I'd be an example of that. So again, the stats for my community do not tell the positive sides of the story about how education has gone for some people, because it does not record people like myself as being a part of that community. Going on to Louis Oakluck now, she discusses Western epistemologies alongside Inuit views of understanding and research. She does this as a very important part because it's important that when non-Indigenous people have approached, there has been issues about how that information has been shared with the communities, and that in some cases, researchers have taken that information and simply left, not actually sharing with them. She situates that her lineage and where she's coming from is a very important part of understanding Inuit ways of knowing. She reviews their own journey alongside researching ways of knowing. She highlights that Western research is more of a fact-finding approach, whereas to Indigenous researchers, it is key to preserve and include cultural and traditional knowledge. So it's not just about the fact-finding approach from a Western research side, but for Indigenous research, especially for someone who's a Nook, like herself, it is key for preserving and including that cultural and traditional knowledge because there's things that are based on that. And I can't use, there's not a word that I don't have the word to describe properly how it is for many Indigenous nations. There's a word that can describe exactly how you put this all together. And I can't really fully express that to you at this point, because I'm still learning that word and how to go about saying it. But it incorporates that in how you're supposed to understand that moving forward. When you're doing this research, you're doing that. It's supposed to be done in a good way. You're doing it with the community. You are working with the community. That information doesn't just belong to you and the institution you might be doing it through, or the organization you are, but also to that community that you're working with. And that relationship, it's a relationship being built. It is not just a simple you collect and go, but it will become a long-term relationship. Margaret Kovacs has highlighted, she assesses the history of qualitative research. She explains how qualitative methodologies can coincide with Indigenous ways of knowing. There's a lot of overlapping that occurs with qualitative methodology alongside Indigenous ways of knowing and assessing things. The difference between Indigenous methodologies and qualitative methods, however, are that Indigenous knowledges have a fluidity and motion that is manifested in the distinctive structure of tribal languages. So again, I was talking about when there is a word, but I can't fully describe it to you as what it would fully mean in English, because it just doesn't translate right. Indigenous methodologies are guided by tribal epistemologies, and tribal knowledge is not Western knowledge. So again, having those relationships, you have certain responsibilities and requirements that you have to follow along. Joyce Green, another Indigenous scholar who did political science, she highlighted that, for some work that is done, we can't put it on our resume as Indigenous scholars because it is being done for the community, and it's okay to not have to, we don't have to put it on everything, but there are things that we do that won't be able to be noticed or talked about or shown on our resume or put in paper format to be assessed by a committee down the road for us, because it is not for the academic institution, it's not for the Western institution, it's not for the state, it's for our own nations and the work that we can help them. It's a part of that community, it belongs to that community, it doesn't belong to us. For Indigenous methodologies and ways of approaching those, there are common threads that are important from looking at especially those three examples that I highlighted. Identification, being able to identify yourself and how you identify yourself, your connection, who you belong to, and what that lineage is. So again, for me, it would be, I am the son of Beverly Cowie, or Red Sky, or Red Thunderbird woman. She is the daughter of George Cowie Jr., who is the son of George Cowie Sr. There's a whole connection that we would go right back through, showing that connection through a paternal and maternal side, if on both sides you are Indigenous. There's a responsibility to the nation community whom research is with. This goes in place not just for Indigenous people, but also for non-Indigenous people who are going to do research or making that relationship, building that relationship with these communities, with these nations, as well as those institutions, organizations that are in place. Again, it's a long-term relationship. Data and knowledge is shared with the nation and community whom is research relating to. Again, it's not just belonging to you as a researcher or to the institution that you are doing the research for. It also belongs to that community that you have that relationship that you are building over the long term. And especially for Indigenous scholars, we have to have a foot in both worlds, or a foot in both canoes, is the way to say it. We have to be planted in our own nations and our own communities and our own ways of understanding. But we also have to follow those rules and follow those obligations and those key things that are expected of us. But it's the same thing that we have to do in the Western world, in the Western sense of academia. So we don't just have one set of rules that we have to follow, we have other ones. And for us, that means blending and trying to respect all of it while making sure that we're able to go forward in a good way doing the research that we are. My last point I want to highlight as I'm concluding this is another quote by Margaret Kovacs, again, highlighting the importance to understand where we're coming from. We know what we know from where we stand. We need to be honest. With that, I will conclude. Miigwech, thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I will unshare my screen now and look forward to talking more with you guys in person.
So thank you, Chad, for that wonderful presentation. I see some rounds of applause. Feel free to give them a round of applause. And I would like to also encourage you all to start typing your questions. Chad, I think we need to write a paper. You should see my notes here, because there's actually a lot in which you were speaking about that is important for the area that I work in. You talk about preserving knowledge. You talk about epistemologies. Well, in my field, we talk about ontologies and definitions, making sure that we can identify who is who, and understanding the validity of the data in ways that are important to the people themselves. So for example, patient-reported experience measures. So there's a lot I think we need to talk about offline. And if anyone else is interested, reach out to me. But I'm not going to hijack the conversation. I'm going to get back to the schedule. So I do have a couple of questions, though, that I would like to ask relating to your presentation. The first is that you mentioned the idea that a lot of the reporting as it relates to Indigenous communities, Indigenous experience, Indigenous, let's say, health status and well-being, and not just health status, but just the status of communities, focuses on socio-economic factors. This can often lead us into a deficit framework of sort of thinking and reporting. And this is something that I talk to my students about, being sure about the language that we're using and ensuring that we're being reflexive about how we're reporting data, because there is a narrative associated with that. So the work of Margot Greenwood, Sarah Delau, and Lindsay sort of speaks to the causes of the causes. And you mentioned some of these. You talked about colonization. You talked about, racism and discrimination, and a lot of these factors that are actually the underlying causes of many of the SES trajectories or patterns, distributions, and determinants of the diseases that we're seeing. Could you sort of speak to those causes of causes and why it's so important that we capture these in our reporting, in our research methods more broadly?
I think it's important for me able to catch up, because I know when we're approaching things, and sometimes this is what happens in government sense, or where we're focused on this idea of the 5-year term or what can be done quickly. What we're talking about, especially when we're talking about Indigenous people, we're talking about people who have been, still are being colonized. They still have a lot of shots being called for them or being made for them. As again, I will restate, I'm a ward of the state. If I die tomorrow, Canada technically can decide what to do with my body. But that's because of that long-standing Indian activism, because of that colonization, that mentality. So if we're actually looking at ways of moving forward instead of doing band-aid solutions, it's important to acknowledge and understand that history that exists there. That for many Indigenous people, that some of the issues that they face are learned behaviors because of what was done, that there are things that have impacted them, that there has been a loss of identity. When we need to remember, what we're talking about, people who, again, their identity is still told to them by a side of the colonial state. Many are still trying to refine their identity. Many are refining who they are connected to, because many were forced out of their communities. Many were adopted out in the cases of the 60 scoop and the millennial scoop. There's a whole process going through that. So we're talking about people who literally have had their identities taken away from them and prevented from being able to be given to them over their lifespan so far. So understanding that history and understanding that it's more than just access to money or access to services, that there is a whole long history there. It's very demeaning. It's very hard when you listen regularly over and over again about comments about yourself. We forget that that's the case for a lot of Indigenous people, whether we realize that it's within the services that we are. The amount of things that I've heard through university, and I know we've talked about this for people who are listening. Ramon and I we went to the same school for undergrad, and we have mutual friends. There's so many times I wanted to quit because it was such a shock for me. Or when Indigenous issues were discussed, I was the lone Indigenous person in my class, and I'd have my hand up the entire class and I got ignored. I got to listen to other people decide what rights I should have or should not have. Well, I got silenced. So I would joke and say that that's a good example of how the Canadian state works for us. So, but it's very important for understanding those factors and what can we do. And it's the same thing with when we talk about, especially in healthcare, that there are different things that would show, for instance, if there's going to be a stroke or heart attack for women than there are male. We're realizing that now. We need to also realize that for other groups of people, that there are things that need to be taken into consideration. Why are First Nations people 15 years? Why is their lifespan 15 years younger? Well, there's a lot of stress and there's a lot of hardship that you have to go through. There's a lot of things that you hold in. Many deal with more than enough things that are negative, but you learn to have to do that. You shouldn't have to do it, but you learn to have to. And understanding why that is, and that there's a lot of education that needs to go into there, and that we can see in the systems that free from bias doesn't exist because it does permeate, it does come out with how Indigenous people get approached or get looked at in regards to many services that exist. Understanding that that is an actual problem. I have more faith in Canadians than I do politicians, as we see a lot of politicians have said there's no structural racism, but we need to remember things like the RCMP. RCMP was put into place to mitigate and police the prairies and the Northwest after the rebellion or after the resistance in 1885. They come into place to control Native people as well. So there is that long-standing history. We need to remember that as well with how policing is looked at for that. That for many going into the education system, it was used to destroy who they were, or to take away from that connection to their family. The healthcare system, many would go to the healthcare system and never come back. So there's a lot of this stuff that needs to be understood for why they're stressed, but also that a lot of factors that exist for how Indigenous people live are things that were put onto them or forced onto them without little choice from those who we're talking about.
Thank you, Chad. And I'm going to ask one more follow-up question, but again, I would like to sort of put it out there that it's the time to put your questions in the chat. And I know we used healthcare as a prime example here, but I think that you feel free to focus on your sectoral lens, your disciplinary lens. This certainly applies across all of those. So social services, criminal justice, education. If you have questions pertaining to those, Chad can certainly speak to those. Chad, my follow-up question, and I'd like to get to Janet Brown's question. It really is about the critical importance of research. Obviously, I often frame research as research data, but I'm just going to say research more broadly in building nations. The sovereignty that you need to have over that research. I wanted to know your thoughts about, to what extent should Indigenous communities and individuals be involved, and the barriers that you see in terms of making that happen. Do you think you could speak to those points?
Yeah, for sure. It's important to be able to have control over our own data and information that includes our history. A lot of it has been taken and has been prevented from coming to us. So you see some communities who are working towards this, some nations. There's work going on with the 6 communities that make up my nation, like I said. But how they're able to house it, where they can house it, the cost and ability to house it when you have so many other issues and underfunding going on in communities, how will that be stored? Are there going to be able to be agreements with institutions to be able to help store that needs where need be? Those are going to be key things that need to be looked at for going forward. If the community cannot store it themselves, but is it a way of having that long-standing or a long-term relationship built and that trust built with, for instance, different academic institutions, different universities to be able to move forward? That will be key for being able to do that. How communities start to come back as a nation moving forward, especially when we're talking about today. And there's stuff that I can't fully talk about it from the perspective of the work I'm doing with the Mississauga Anishinaabe, but I'm excited for what I'm seeing come from that as someone who's a part of that nation and being a part of helping to reestablish that and gather that information. But again, looking at when we talk about data, there's other things that go alongside with those numbers, right? That we have to understand. They're important, but the story behind why those numbers are that way are very important. And those communities need that to be able to understand, or not understand, but the communities need to be able to show that and have access to that. So that way they can interpret and explain those numbers rather than outside sources telling them what those numbers mean, because it's not always done very well.
Well, thank you. Janet Brown has a question. She asks, how do we respect differences among First Nations themselves when approaching research from government? In terms of worldview, she would like to know, and ways of sharing information.
So I think a key thing for that in regards to government is we need to remember it's not a one size fit all. It's not going to be we need to be careful of pan-indigenizing or even pan-First Nation, First Nationizing. I don't know how to say it that way, but that needs to be a very key thing that needs to be understood. For coming from Saskatchewan, you have different treated areas. You also have different districts for the Métis. It's key to understanding how that works and how they operate within their territory and that history of being connected to that territory. But also the difference in the communities and the nations will be very key. So if you're going to approach it, it may take longer to do, but it's more important to do it the right way rather than do it the way that it's been continuously done, and then we don't get results, especially when it's expected, or that we want to see results happen in 5 years. But again, it's that long-term relationship building as well. And sometimes this is hard within the government because there's such turnover and changes that happen within departments that, you could be dealing with someone for a year and then all of a sudden you're with someone else. Despite Carolyn Bennett having some flaws in the end, what we saw, some of the things that had happened onto her, the one positive thing I would say about how the Trudeau government handled handled the Crown Indigenous relationship for so long was that it was the same person. I don't think there has been a longer person who's held that same position for as long as she did. And when I'm looking back at past Indian Affairs ministers and that, but that's key because it helps with establishing that relationship and moving forward. But also knowing when it does need to be changed and making sure that the transition is done well on that inside. And again, you're bringing people in to meet them in order to move forward. You can't just simply leave and pass it over to the other person. There's a whole transition that goes on, goes along with that to be able to do that.
Excellent. And folks, you're also welcome to unmute and speak. Just put up your hand and I'll call on you as well. So thank you for that, Chad. I have a question from Martin Boucher. He's a fellow faculty member. How do you see the role of non-Indigenous people with the advancement of Indigenous methodologies?
Good question. I'll admit I'm still trying to. I'll take, if anyone's read Linda Twally Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodology, she tries to handle this in a chapter and she comes out and says that she doesn't fully know yet either. And I'm still personally in that process of struggling. The basic or the introductory way that I can highlight to that for non-Indigenous people is that, again, establishing that relationship, working with someone who can help you with that and going into it knowing that, this is not just going to be a one-time thing, that you're not just going to be able to take the stuff and go, that you have a responsibility to those people and to that community, to that nation. But trust has to be established and you must not allow that trust to be broken. There's times you're going to have to sit there and listen and just absorb where they're going to go over stuff with you. It's going to be a process. And sometimes obviously it helps when you have people who can say, yes, this person is trying, they're actually trying to do better. That's obviously important as well. But that's as far as I can highlight from that right now, because again, there's a long-term process and the way we've done research for so long has been a repetitive structure where it has not gone well, where it's a top-down approach, where, if results aren't done in 3 years after, we're still not acknowledging that, it's been 150, 200, 300 years to get to the point of how things are, then, that's not going to help. But you have to actually look further than that and past that. And the non-Indigenous side needs to actually understand and going forward with this, that it's not just a check mark on a to-do list, but it's a long-term process that will not ever stop. Like when I came into doing the research for the Mississauga communities, as soon as I agreed to it, I know that meant that was permanently going to be in my life until the day that I'm dying. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Chad. A lot of what you're saying was reminding me of when I used to work in public health knowledge translation. And, we talked about integrated knowledge translation, really thinking about, we have these sort of rigid sort of metrics of research success and really rethinking and reframing that. Maybe it's about the impact. Maybe it's about the relationship and the partnerships that we establish, really trying to bring in some of those integrated knowledge translations ideas here. I have another question from a colleague, Vince Hopkins. Research happens in an institutional context. What can universities do to support responsible research that respects Indigenous ways of knowing? And this question also goes for the tri-agencies.
Well, the tri-agencies. Many institutions have a process that's in place, especially when it comes to doing Indigenous research. Depending on where that institution is, I would hope that they have established that connection and gone over it with the nation whose territory they're on, the communities they are, but also looking at ways to be able to let it be a living tree in a sense, let it be organic. That, in some cases, a person who's doing research work, it might have to be slightly altered for a different nation or a different community that you're doing work with. That will be key to be able to understand that and making sure that when it's being approached, that nation or community who you are working with is able to be at the table as an equal way of looking at it and assessing what will be okay and what will not be, what is expected from their side alongside it. Like I said, for Indigenous scholars, we tend to know what we're getting into, not all, but we tend to know kind of what's expected of us from when we're doing this work, that we have an obligation, that what we're gathering does not just belong to us, it belongs to that nation or that community that we're working with, especially if it's our community, that relationship will always be going on. That will be key for how we, that's key for looking at how to go forward with that. I would say it could pass over to the same thing for those organizations when looking at how to go forward with it. Again, it's a process that is going to be a long-term process that has to be established. You have to, for working with Indigenous peoples, especially, you have to be able to show that you're not just there to take. And that's what I really want to stress. You're not just there to take, but you're there understanding that, this is a new relationship that you need to be able to build in a respectful and positive way going forward.
Excellent. I have another question here from Priscilla. Can emotional intelligence play a role in creating relational building between colonial structures and Indigenous ways of knowing or on knowing?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So the question is essentially asking, what role does emotional intelligence play in relationship building to sort of dismantle many of the colonial structures and better integrate and incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing? So in emotional intelligence.
I've never been asked a question like that. So can you explain to me more by what you mean by emotional intelligence? Because I might have a different way of looking at this. And I want to make sure that I approach it properly.
Sure. Priscilla, are you able to unmute and ask the question directly?
Sure. So with emotional intelligence, it talks about the ability to identify and regulate own emotions and also to recognize the emotions of other people and to feel empathy toward them and to use these abilities to communicate effectively to build healthy, productive relationships with others. Could there a piece of that be incorporated to help repair and rebuild some of those relationships between colonial and Indigenous ways of knowing?
I think so. Yes, I think that's important because like when we're approaching this, and so when I what we're talking about, it's usually the second week of I'd say introductory. It's usually when I teach my students during the first or second week of the class that I've been teaching the last few years. And I highlight them to them. I remind them, we're not just talking policy. We're not just talking about, statistics. We're talking about people. We're talking about people who this affects every day. And actually, we're talking about things that impact them on a regular basis. It impacts me on a regular basis. So we need to remember that there's a human component here. It's not just policy. It's not just paper. It's not just statistics. And it helps to reset and establish that understanding that there's more to it than just looking at it and pretending like, there's no life in a sense there. I think it is important to consider, especially when looking at some of what's going on and what needs to be done, especially for moving forward, and that there has to be empathy there. I know we like to say again that the way that the system works now is that it's not to have that because you need to be free of bias. You can't make a connection. But what I just talked about was highlighting that there is already a bias there, and by adding that ability to understand people that we're talking about on more of a normal level, on a human level, helps with being able to look at ways to be able to move forward and to understand where they're coming from, especially when we're talking about that colonial history and relationship that still exists.
Thank you, Chad. Does that answer your question, Priscilla?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Excellent. So this is a final call for questions. We may end a little bit early, but I do have another question for you, Chad, while I sort of give folks a chance if they'd like to add another question in the chat. So my question pertains, and it's somewhat of an experience, having worked in public health, again, as I mentioned, doing my education in information management epidemiology gave me a very black and white point of view, but it was when I was working with communities, talking with people, that I started to see that there are other ways in which we can report data and other ways in which I think we can, mobilize change. So I want to talk to you about methodologies that are uniquely Indigenous in many respects, storytelling, the use of art. You talked about the close relationship between qualitative methods and Indigenous sort of worldviews. Could you speak to some of those other methods and perhaps how somebody with a quantitative background could start to look to those, either in their own practice or just for better understanding of the problem?
For quantitative side, for that, I strongly suggest picking up the book by Chris Anderson and Megan Walter, because it does a really good job at explaining that numbers and the way it's interpreted because of that inherent bias that already exists there. So especially approaching it from a quantitative approach, and usually when we're looking for numbers, we're already approaching it with a question that we have in mind. But trying to work as hard as possible to remove yourself from those mindsets or those popular stereotypes when it comes to when we're talking about Indigenous peoples when looking at it through the numbers, because the numbers coalesce, they'll go along with some of those stereotypes that exist, the idea of not being educated, the issue of high suicide rates. But again, seeing how the perspective from the communities is very important to see how those numbers can be looked at differently. But on top of that, those numbers, there's always going to be issues with those stats when it comes to First Nations and Métis people in Canada, because, for instance, the stats that come from Six Nations they don't exist because they don't participate. So you're not getting a full picture here, especially when you're talking about Six Nations. When it comes to education, it's not considering people who live outside of the communities, if the community even does participate in statistics and actually is willing to give over that information. Who lives, what the population of a community is. Most communities will go by their overall membership and who actually is a part of the community versus who actually lives on that community with a status card. There's things like that need to be taken into consideration when you're looking at those numbers, because there's more to it than just how it's done by the Canadian state. And even my own work, when I talk about elections and voting, I always have to put a footnote that says, these numbers, these stats are subjected to or at issue because, not everyone who lives in communities are status First Nation, don't have status or not status Indian according to the Indian Act. There are non-Indigenous people who live there as well. And then, we're not taking into consideration people who might be coming from outside of the community. So for instance, in my community, the ballot box is at my band office, but the ballot box also serves the entire kind of section of the county that my community is in. So it's not just people who live on reserve, but also non-Indigenous people who live off the reserve who can come vote at that ballot box. So the numbers and how that poll goes is majority influenced by people who are from outside of the community to begin with. So, for instance, I've seen people argue that, my community votes conservative. No, it doesn't vote conservative. It's just, I'm in a rural area and a lot of people outside of the community also vote in that poll. So of course it's going to go that way because they tend to lean that way. But if you come to my community during election, you'll see a lot of orange and red and green. It's not a lot of blue. It's just how it works where I'm from. But again, that's something that has to be taken into consideration because you have to actually go there and see those stats. You have to see the houses that have what colors outside of them and know the boundary of the community is an example of what I would say with that. So the numbers, you always have to, you have to proceed with caution when it comes to the numbers from when looking at Indigenous stats, for instance. And what other areas were you looking at for this question, Ramona?
No, that's great. I think you've answered that question. I have two more questions and then a comment, which it's a great comment to end off on. So from Sheila, she says, I'm a writer interested in writing about an older First Nations man who has played a part in the creation of water studies of the Qu'Appelle River Basin. What obligations do archives have to Indigenous people in doing family or personal research? Are there people who can help? What if research is already underway in the area of interest? Do scholars help?
So again, some of those things that have been recorded by Archives Canada or that's recorded is going to come from people outside the community. So it's important if you know who the person is that you're talking about or the group that you're talking about, that you make a connection to that people and try to reach out. It will take a bit because again, there is not shyness, but there is very critical views of academics and researchers coming to the community and good reason for why there's that critical view. But it's a long-term process. So not just connecting and going through archives, but if there's a way to connect, especially for such things as this, if there's a way to connect to the community that person's from and reach out to the community, but also go through the proper protocols to reaching out would be key. So for instance, if I'm approaching someone for research, it's traditional, especially for First Nations, you give tobacco. It's a sign of respect that you're asking them you're asking for their time. You give tobacco. In some cases, we see honorariums now. But again, it's also a relationship that has to be built. And even I have to do that in some places that I'm doing that because I'm not connected to every nation. But if I have friends who know that they can vouch for me and make that connection, that's a very important way of being able to get into the community. And in some places, it's taken a while for me to do that, especially when I lived out.
Excellent. And she says that she's known her friend for 25 years. So it looks like she's put in the work as far as relationship is concerned. So I have one last question, and then I'll finish on this wonderful comment. So from Merity Ball, what would you say to young Indigenous youth as far as educational areas that they could focus on to have the most impact for advancement of their communities as well as outside their communities?
For young Indigenous peoples, for youth who are looking to go into people who are in the system, there's a place for all of us. And the way that I've approached it, I know because I do political science, I have a foot of both canoes. I blend with white Canadians. There's assumptions that are made for that. The way I grew up is that the Creator gives us all gifts. My gift has been doing what I do now and being able to do that, the way that I approach things. That there is a place for us all to exist and to not let the naysayers get out of the way. I help myself. The way that I help myself in going forward is that there are many people who came before me, especially in my field. When I started my graduate work for political science, I had to go out west. There was no options in the east. I did my MA at the University of Manitoba with Kara Ladner, and then I went out, and I'm now out at the University of Alberta. But there was four Indigenous scholars in political science. They were all out east. That's still on the process of changing. The numbers going up, but there are people to work with and how to go forward. What my MA advisor went through, what Joyce Green went through in her process of being able to get through the door, they had to really kick through the door, make holes in the walls, break windows to be able to get through that wall that was in place. And for me, I'm doing a disservice by not continuing on. I've had to kick and scream to go through stuff too, to get to the point that I am now. But I know that it would have been far worse had it not been for the headway that they've made. That there are people to support them going forward, and that whether it's academic or whether it's learning from our lands, learning on our lands, learning our structures, learning our language, however it is. So there's many things outside of academia for youth to consider as well as within it. It depends on how they want to approach it. Do they want to approach it as someone who has a foot in both canoes? Do they want to utilize that to be able to actually bring back to their community? Or do they simply want to absorb themselves into more the Western way of learning? That's going to be the personal choices for those youth. It's going to be different depending on the nation. Again, how the Métis approach it, Métis youth and what they're taught is not the same necessarily in regards to where I'm from. There's differences from Anishinaabe, especially Mississauga, from Haudenosaunee, from Haida, from Dene. That's important to acknowledge and moving forward, that there are going to be people who can work with, that you can work with, and to not let anyone tell you that you're not good enough to be able to do it, and that no matter what you're doing, in order to decolonize, to reconcile, to move forward, to rebuild, there's a multiple pronged way of doing that. And that can include utilizing education, includes learning about our land, includes learning our language, taking to the streets. There's multiple ways to do that, and that's very key. And we all have a gift that we're able to put forth that the Creator gives us in order to be able to make those things happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Chad. So I just wanted to highlight that I received a direct message from one of our audience members saying that she's already reserved many of the books that you've highlighted in your presentation at the Regina Public Library. So she wanted to thank you for referencing those and providing those resources and tips. So that's excellent. Okay, so we've reached the end of our session, and I want to thank you all for being here for the entire time or just watching the presentation. It was really informative. It was certainly the stories that you told, Chad, that were very personal. I will carry those with me, and as somebody who interacts with people who and teach people who work with a lot of this data and work with diagnosis and misdiagnosis and being able to help with some of those misclassifications, I think it's important to have those stories. It's very important. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you again, Chad, for sharing your insight with us. If you enjoyed this lecture, please keep an eye on JSGS events calendar, where upcoming events are being promoted, including the JSGS Virtual Case Study Showcase, which is coming up on May 18th. At this event, you will hear presentations from current online MPAs who will be completing their 2-week residency by presenting policy recommendations to a panel of judges. All are welcome to attend, and we would like to see you there. Karen will post links to this event and the JSGS in the JSGS events calendar in the chat. So if you would like to attend that, look in the chat now. Please join me in a round of applause for our speaker using Zoom's reaction options. You can see the love around the room, Chad. Thank you again. So yeah, sorry, go ahead, Chad.
I just said miigwech, sorry.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today again. For everyone else, have a wonderful afternoon. Take care now.